It was a common September morning in 2015 when Larry Bird walked into the Dan Patrick Show studios, not imagining that his next words would generate one of the biggest controversies in modern basketball history. You can perceive that sometimes the most unexpected statements reveal profound truths about the sport we love. Only 4 months had passed since Steph Curry had conquered his first NBA title with the Golden State Warriors. The 27-year-old point guard was at the EGV, absolute peak of his initial career. Regular season MVP, NBA champion, and responsible for a revolution in basketball with his impossible three-point shots. In that summer of 2015, it was impossible to escape Steph Curry's name. He had just broken the record for three-point shots in a season with an impressive 286 makes, a number that seemed absurd at the time. His plays circulated on social media like viral phenomena, and analysts from around the world declared that we were witnessing the birth of the greatest shooter in history. "Curry changed the game forever," commentators repeated. "We've never seen anything like what he does on the court." But Larry Bird, sitting comfortably in the studio chair, had a completely different perspective. How is it possible that one of the NBA's greatest legends could see something that everyone else was missing? Bird wasn't just any former player giving an opinion. He was a 3-time NBA champion, MVP of 3 consecutive seasons, and widely considered one of the greatest shooters basketball had ever produced. "Larry, everyone's talking about Steph Curry being the best shooter of all time," Dan Patrick said, leaning forward with that expression of someone ready to hear an obvious confirmation. "What do you think of that statement?" The silence that followed was charged with a tension no one in the studio expected. Bird looked at Patrick with that calm and calculating expression that characterized each of his analyses. It was the look of someone who had seen decades of elite basketball and knew how to distinguish hype from reality. "Well, Dan," Bird began, his voice maintaining that slow and thoughtful cadence typical of someone who chooses each word carefully. "Chris Mullin was very good. And Mark Price? In terms of shooters, Curry is one of the best." "Up to that point, nothing out of the ordinary." Patrick nodded, anticipating that Bird would confirm the general consensus about Curry. "But," Bird continued, "and you can perceive that this small word was loaded with decades of experience and observation, Reggie Miller made as many excellent shots as anyone, if you look back over the years." The air in the studio became heavier. Patrick frowned, clearly not expecting the conversation to take this direction. And then came the phrase that would change everything. "Reggie Miller was a more clutch shooter than Steph Curry," Bird declared with the tranquility of someone who was simply stating an obvious fact. Have you ever wondered how a single phrase can stop time? How 16 words can generate shockwaves that spread throughout an entire sport? What happened in that studio was exactly that, a moment that would divide opinions and generate debates for years. Patrick was visibly surprised. His expression was that of someone who had just heard something completely unexpected, almost absurd. We were in 2015. Curry had just had the most revolutionary season any shooter had ever had in the NBA, and a legend was questioning his position in history. "More clutch?" Patrick repeated, as if he wanted to make sure he had heard correctly. "That's right," Bird confirmed, without showing any sign that he was backing down from the controversial statement. "Whether to tie the game, open a 1-point lead, or win the game, I saw him, played against him, and coached him." Something that touches deeply is when we realize that great truths often come disguised as controversial statements. Bird wasn't being provocative for fun. He was sharing a perception based on decades of experience at the highest level of professional basketball. The truth is that anyone can make a shot when the game is tied," Bird continued, his voice gaining an intensity that captured everyone's attention in the studio. "It's when you're losing by 1 or 2 points that it gets difficult. How many guys make that shot?" Naturally, this leads us to question what it really means to be clutch in basketball. Curry was breaking records and winning titles, but Bird was talking about something deeper: the psychological ability to shine in the darkest moments, when pressure is overwhelming and failure means the end. To understand the dimension of what Bird was saying, we need to go back in time and understand who Reggie Miller was in the 90s. Miller wasn't just an exceptional shooter. He was known as Killer Instinct. In the most tense moments of the playoffs, when entire teams went into panic, Miller became even more dangerous. "I saw Reggie do things that froze entire arenas," Bird remembered, his eyes shining with the memory of epic duels. He had a coldness in decisive moments that few players can achieve. What's most impressive is how Bird was evaluating Curry not just for what he had done, but for what he had not yet proven capable of doing. In 2015, Curry had not yet faced the maximum pressures of the playoffs. Multiple times, he had not yet collected those moments of pure genius under extreme pressure that would define his career in the following years. "Curry is incredible," Bird clarified, making it clear he wasn't diminishing the young player's talent. "But I need to see more decisive moments before placing him above someone like Reggie Miller." Bird's words echoed through the basketball world like an earthquake. Social media exploded with divided reactions. Curry fans felt offended. Analysts began debating furiously whether Bird was right or being unfair to the Warriors' young star. "How can he say that?" screamed Curry's defenders. "The guy just had the best shooting season in history." "Bird knows basketball better than anyone," others retorted. "If he's saying that, he must have a reason." Have you ever wondered how an opinion can reveal so much about the historical moment of a sport? Bird's statement wasn't just about Curry or Miller. It was about the difference between exceptional skill and proven greatness under maximum pressure. The debate intensified when other former players began to position themselves. Some supported Bird, remembering Miller's historic moments against the Knicks, especially that unforgettable night in 1995, when he scored 8 points in 9 seconds and broke New York's heart at Madison Square Garden. "Reggie did that constantly," commented Robert Kim, former ESPN analyst. "In the most impossible moments, he found a way to destroy his opponents psychologically." Others defended Curry, arguing that his 2015 season had been so revolutionary that it deserved immediate respect from veterans. "Bird is stuck in the past," argued James Wilson, columnist for the San Francisco Chronicle. "Curry is redefining what it means to be a great shooter." But perhaps the most fascinating aspect of Bird's statement was its perfect timing. He had planted a seed of doubt exactly when Curry seemed to be on top of the world. It was as if Bird was saying, "You're good, kid, but you haven't proven to be great yet." Something that touches deeply is how life's greatest lessons sometimes come disguised as criticism that initially hurts us. Bird wasn't attacking Curry out of malice. He was presenting a challenge based on decades of experience at the sport's highest level. "I have nothing against Steph Curry," Bird clarified in subsequent interviews. "I'm just saying there are still things he needs to prove, and I hope he proves them." And that was exactly where the magic began to happen. Somewhere in California, Steph Curry was hearing these statements. The young MVP was being questioned by one of the NBA's greatest legends, and his reaction to this provocation would define not only his career, but would forever change how we think about greatness in basketball. What's most impressive is how Bird, unknowingly, had just provided Steph Curry with exactly the motivation he needed to become not just a great player, but an absolute legend of the sport. But what happened next would surprise even Larry Bird. To understand why Larry Bird made such a controversial statement about Steph Curry, we need to dive into the mind of a man who had dedicated his entire life to basketball at the highest possible level. Bird wasn't speaking as a common commentator or just any former player. He was speaking as someone who had lived, breathed, and bled elite basketball for more than 3 decades. You can perceive that there's an abysmal difference between watching basketball and living basketball. Larry Bird had done both, and his perspective was shaped by experiences that few human beings would ever have the chance to live. "When I say that Reggie Miller was more clutch," Bird explained in a later conversation with Carlos Mendez, veteran ESPN reporter, "I'm not diminishing what Curry does. I'm talking about a specific quality that you only recognize when you've gone through moments where each shot can define an entire career." Something that touches deeply is discovering that great truths about sports competition can only be understood by those who have personally faced maximum pressure. Bird had played against Reggie Miller during the most intense years of both careers and had witnessed up close something that statistics could never capture. During the 80s and early 90s, when Bird was still active with the Boston Celtics, the confrontations between Celtics and Indiana Pacers were true psychological wars. Miller, young and ambitious, had transformed Bird into his personal test of greatness. Each encounter between them was a masterclass in mental resistance and execution under pressure. "Reggie had something I rarely saw in other players," Bird remembered, his eyes distant as if he were reliving those intense moments. The greater the pressure, the calmer he became. It was as if the most difficult moments of the game were exactly where he felt most at home. How is it possible for a player to become more dangerous exactly when circumstances become more adverse? Bird had observed this phenomenon in Miller repeatedly, and it had left an indelible impression on his understanding of what separated good players from true legends. Bird's most vivid memory dated from May 25, 1995. Game 1 of the Eastern Conference, Indiana Pacers against New York Knicks at the legendary Madison Square Garden. The Knicks led by 6 points with only 18.7 seconds remaining in the game. For any casual observer, the game was decided. "I was watching at home," Bird remembered, and you can perceive that even years later, the intensity of that moment still impacted him. "I saw Reggie get the ball and immediately knew something special was about to happen. It wasn't just confidence, it was a coldness that bordered on the supernatural." What happened next would become one of the most legendary sequences in NBA history. Miller hit a three-point shot, stole the ball on the following inbound, hit another three-point shot. In just 9 seconds of real game time, he had scored 8 points and transformed a certain defeat into a miraculous Pacers victory. 8 points in 9 seconds, Bird repeated slowly, as if he still couldn't completely believe what he had witnessed. But it wasn't just the points. It was the way he executed each movement. Zero hesitation. Zero fear. It was as if he knew exactly what was going to happen before it even happened. Naturally, this leads us to understand what Bird really meant when he questioned Steph Curry's clutch ability. It wasn't about technical skill or natural talent. It was about something deeper. The ability to elevate one's own performance exactly when everything is at stake. "The difference between a great shooter and a legendary shooter," Bird explained, "is what happens when you're losing by 2 points, 15 seconds left, and 60,000 people are screaming against you. In that moment, your technique doesn't change, but your mind needs to be in a completely different place." What's most impressive is how Bird had developed this understanding not just by observing other players, but through his own experiences in his career's most crucial moments. He knew personally what it was like to feel the weight of enormous expectations, how it was necessary to find internal reserves of calm and precision when the entire world was watching. Bird remembered his own rivalry with Magic Johnson and how each confrontation between them in the playoffs was a lesson in execution under maximum pressure. Magic and I understood that great players are defined not by what they do when they're dominating, but by what they do when they're desperate. It was exactly this lesson that Bird had applied to his evaluation of Reggie Miller versus Steph Curry in 2015. Curry had had an incredible season, Bird admitted, but I needed to see how he would react when things weren't going well, when he was backed against the wall, when each shot was a matter of life or death for his team. Have you ever wondered why some criticisms bother us more than others? Sometimes it's because they touch on truths we're not yet ready to recognize. In 2015, Curry had proven to be an exceptional player, but had not yet faced the moments of maximum adversity that define legendary careers. Reggie Miller played dozens of games where he was losing in the EP, final moments, Bird continued. And in many of those games, he found a way to turn the result around. Not with impossible or lucky plays, but with cold and calculated execution exactly when pressure was unbearable. Bird remembered another memorable Miller performance, this time against the Celtics themselves in 1991. We were leading by 3 points, 12 seconds left. Miller got the ball at mid-court, dribbled through the entire defense, and hit an impossible three-point shot to force overtime, then won the game in overtime with 2 more decisive shots. Something that touches deeply is realizing that Bird wasn't being unfair to Curry. He was applying the same rigorous standard that had been applied to him during his career. When I was young, Bird reflected, veterans like John Havlicek told me I hadn't proven anything yet until winning a championship. At the time, I thought it was unfair. Today, I understand they were challenging me to reach my maximum greatness. Bird's perspective on clutch moments went beyond statistics or records. It was about the psychological ability to function at the highest level when everything was falling apart around. Any NBA player can make shots when they're feeling good and confident, he explained. Few can make the same shots when they're nervous, tired, and facing the real possibility of failing publicly. Bird had coached Miller as coach of the Pacers years after retiring as a player, and this experience had reinforced his admiration for the shooter's unique mentality. As a coach, I could see Reggie up close in practice and game situations, Bird told. He really became more focused when pressure increased. It was as if he had been programmed for the most difficult moments. What's most impressive is how Bird was trying to communicate a deeper lesson about sports greatness through his controversial comparison. He wasn't diminishing Curry, but establishing a standard of excellence based on decades of experience at the sport's top. Steph Curry has all the talent in the world, Bird concluded that day on the Dan Patrick Show, but talent is just the beginning. Real greatness is proven in moments when you don't want to be there, when every fiber of your body is screaming for you to give up, and even so, you find a way to execute perfectly. Bird knew his words would generate controversy, but he also knew they could serve as a catalyst for something greater. Sometimes, young talents need to hear that there are still things to prove, he reflected later, not to discourage them, but to inspire them to reach levels they didn't even know were possible. And that was exactly what was about to happen. Somewhere in California, Steph Curry had heard every word of Larry Bird's interview, and his response to this challenge would change not only his own career, but the history of modern basketball forever. But then something extraordinary began to unfold. Steph Curry heard Larry Bird's words exactly as Bird expected him to hear them, not as an insult, but as a challenge. In his home in the Bay Area, watching the Dan Patrick Show interview a few days after the original broadcast, Curry felt something he hadn't experienced since his college days: the desperate need to prove wrong whoever was doubting him. You can perceive that there's a fundamental difference between players who get offended by criticism and those who use it as fuel. Curry definitely belonged to the second group, and Bird's words had just ignited a flame that would burn for the next years of his career. When I heard what Bird said, my first reaction wasn't anger, Curry confessed months later to Anthony Zhang, the athletic reporter. It was curiosity. I thought, what is he seeing that I'm not seeing in myself? And then I thought, how can I prove he's wrong? Something that touches deeply is discovering that moments of greatest personal growth often are born from the most difficult criticisms to accept. Bird had planted a seed of doubt in Curry's mind, but had also provided a clear roadmap of what needed to be improved: the ability to shine in the darkest moments. The summer of 2015 became a period of intense reflection for Curry. He had just had the best season of his career up to that point, but Bird's words made him question whether he was really reaching his maximum potential. I started watching old Reggie Miller videos, Curry admitted. I wanted to understand what Bird had seen in him that maybe I hadn't yet developed in myself. How is it possible that an NBA MVP, at the height of his confidence, suddenly becomes a student again? Sometimes, life's most valuable lessons come when we least expect them, and Curry was about to embark on a journey of self-improvement that would redefine not only his career, but basketball itself. During that summer, Curry spent hours analyzing Miller's most clutch moments. He watched dozens of times that sequence of 8 points in 9 seconds against the Knicks. He studied how Miller moved without the ball in the final moments of decisive games. He observed his body language when pressure was maximum. What impressed me most about Reggie, Curry revealed, was how he seemed physically relaxed in the most tense moments. While everyone around him was nervous, he was in his element, as if it were just another shot in practice. Naturally, this leads us to understand that Curry wasn't just watching Miller out of curiosity. He was methodically studying how to develop the type of clutch mentality that Bird had questioned. It was as if he were doing a PhD in how to be decisive under maximum pressure. When the 2015-16 season began, something had fundamentally changed in Steph Curry. The Warriors began the season with a different intensity, and Curry seemed to be playing with a purpose that went beyond personal records or recognition. He was playing to answer a specific question. From the first games of the season, I could see that Steph had something to prove, commented Kevin O'Connor, his teammate at the time. He was more focused in the final moments of tight games. It was as if he were actively looking for pressure situations to test himself. What's most impressive is how Curry transformed Bird's criticism into a productive obsession. Instead of just responding verbally, he decided that his response would be through consistent performance in the most difficult moments. The first months of the 2015-16 season were a revelation. Curry wasn't just breaking three-point shot records again. He was making impossible shots in the most crucial moments of games. It was as if he had internalized Bird's lesson and was applying it systematically. In December 2015, in a game against the Oklahoma City Thunder, Curry faced exactly the type of situation Bird had questioned. Warriors losing by 2 points, 12 seconds on the clock, all pressure on his shoulders. Curry got the ball 9 meters from the basket, with 2 defenders in front of him, and hit a three-point shot that silenced the entire arena. That shot was different, observed Daniel Patel, ESPN analyst who covered the Warriors regularly. It wasn't luck or momentary inspiration. It was cold and calculated execution, exactly as Bird had described about Reggie Miller. Have you ever wondered how criticism can become the catalyst for greatness? Curry was living exactly this process. Each clutch game he dominated was a direct response to Bird's questioning of his decisive ability. But it was in February 2016 that Curry really began to show he had completely absorbed the lesson. In a game against the Portland Trail Blazers, the Warriors were losing by 5 points in the final period when Curry completely took control. He scored 17 points in the last 6 minutes, including 4 consecutive three-point shots, all in extremely high-pressure situations. In that game, I saw for the first time what Bird was talking about, commented Christopher Lee, Warriors' assistant coach. Steph wasn't just making difficult shots. He was looking for the most difficult shots in the most tense moments, as if he wanted to prove something to himself. Something that touches deeply is realizing how Curry was systematically building the type of clutch portfolio that Bird had suggested he didn't yet possess. Each decisive game he dominated was an additional page in the book he was writing about his own greatness. Curry's transformation during that season was almost supernatural. He finished the regular season with 402 three-point shots, breaking his own record again. But more important still, he had become exactly the type of clutch player that Bird had questioned whether he could be. The Warriors finished the regular season with 73 wins, breaking the historic record of Michael Jordan's Chicago Bulls. Curry became the first player in history to be voted MVP unanimously. But for him, the most important recognition would come from an unexpected source. During that historic season, I started receiving some comments through people close to Bird, Curry revealed years later. He was paying attention to my evolution and recognizing that I was responding to the challenge he had posed. What's most impressive is how Bird, even without admitting publicly, was carefully observing how Curry would react to his words. I wanted to see if he would take the criticism personally or if he would use it to grow, Bird confessed later. And it quickly became clear that he had chosen the second path. In May 2016, during the Western Conference playoffs, Curry faced his biggest test up to that moment. In Game 6 against the Oklahoma City Thunder, with the Warriors facing elimination, Curry had one of the most clutch performances of his career up to then. He scored 31 points, including several impossible shots in the final moments, forcing a Game 7 that the Warriors would eventually win. In that game against the Thunder, I finally completely understood what Bird was saying, Curry reflected. It wasn't about making shots when you're feeling good. It was about finding a way to make the same shots when everything is against you, when you're exhausted, when pressure is unbearable. Naturally, this leads us to understand that Curry had completed his transformation from great shooter to legendary shooter. Bird's words had worked exactly as intended, not as discouragement, but as a map to greatness. But the final test was still to come, and it would be on a stage where Curry's entire career would be judged by the most rigorous standards possible. Years passed since that controversial Larry Bird interview in 2015. What began as a controversial statement had transformed into one of the most fascinating stories about personal growth and overcoming in professional sports. And in 2022, on a sunny afternoon in Boston, Larry Bird was about to do something few expected: publicly acknowledge that he had helped create a monster. You can perceive that life's greatest lessons sometimes take years to be completely understood. Bird had planted a seed of doubt in Steph Curry in 2015, without imagining he would be watching this seed flourish into a tree of achievements that would redefine modern basketball. When I said that about Steph in 2015, Bird confessed to Ryan Johnson from The Athletic, I was being honest about what I had seen up to that moment, but I was also secretly hoping that he would prove me wrong. And man, he did exactly that, and much more. Something that touches deeply is discovering that sometimes the harshest criticisms are actually the most generous gifts we can receive. In the 7 years that followed Bird's statement, Curry had built a legacy of clutch moments that would make any comparison with Reggie Miller not only valid, but possibly unfair to Miller. The transformation had been systematic and impressive. Curry not only responded to Bird's questioning about his ability in decisive moments, he completely redefined what it meant to be clutch in modern basketball. In 2016, he led the Warriors in a historic 3-1 comeback against the Oklahoma City Thunder. In 2017 and 2018, he dominated the NBA Finals with performances that mixed art and psychological assassination of opponents. The turning point for me was when I watched Game 6 of the 2022 Finals, Bird reflected. Warriors against Celtics, at TD Garden, my spiritual home. Curry scored 34 points that night, including 6 three-point shots, many of them in the game's most crucial moments. How is it possible for a player to transform so completely in response to criticism? The answer was in the methodical approach Curry had adopted since 2015. He hadn't just worked on his technical ability, he had completely reprogrammed his mentality to thrive exactly in the situations Bird had questioned. That night against my Celtics, Bird continued, with a mixture of admiration and respect that surprised even his closest friends. I saw Steph do exactly what I said Reggie did better. He became calmer as the game became more tense. His most important shots came in the most impossible moments. What's most impressive is how Bird was watching not just an exceptional performance, but the culmination of a growth process he himself had initiated with his words 7 years before. It was like watching a work of art that you had inadvertently inspired being finished in front of you. During those 2022 finals, Curry finally conquered his first Finals MVP, the only award missing from his already legendary curriculum. But more than the trophy, he had definitively proven he possessed exactly the quality Bird had questioned: the ability to elevate his game in moments of maximum pressure. After the Warriors won the title in 2022, Bird admitted, I called some people close to Steph and asked them to pass along a message. I wanted him to know he had impressed me not just as a player, but as a competitor. Have you ever wondered what it must feel like to see your own words transform into the catalyst for another human being's greatness? Bird was experiencing exactly that, and the experience had changed his perspective on the role of constructive criticism in developing elite athletes. In retrospect, I realized that my comparison with Reggie Miller in 2015 wasn't unfair, Bird reflected. At the time, it was an honest assessment based on what I had seen, but it was also the push that Steph needed to become not just the player Reggie was, but something even greater. Naturally, this leads us to a deeper understanding of how the psychology of sports greatness works. Curry hadn't simply been offended by Bird's words. He had used them as a blueprint to become exactly the type of player Bird respected. In 2023, during an interview on Steven Rodriguez's podcast, Bird did something few expected: a complete admission that he had underestimated Steph Curry. If I could go back in time and redo that 2015 interview, Bird said, I would say exactly the same thing. Not because I was right about Steph at the time, but because those words helped create the player he became. Something that touches deeply is discovering that Bird had perfectly understood the impact of his words. Sometimes, young talents need to hear that there are still things to prove, he explained. Not to discourage them, but to challenge them to reach levels they didn't even know were possible. The public reconciliation between Bird and Curry happened during the 2024 All-Star Game. In a live broadcast conversation, the two openly discussed the 2015 statement and its impact on Curry's career. "Larry, I never adequately thanked you," Curry said during the interview. "Your words in 2015 gave me exactly the motivation I needed to become the player I always wanted to be." Bird smiled with that satisfied expression of someone who had seen a plan unfold exactly as expected. "Steph, you don't need to thank me. You did all the work. I just pointed in a direction." What's most impressive is how this exchange revealed the true nature of Bird's original statement. There hadn't been malice or disrespect. It had been the recognition of an experienced veteran about what separated talent from legendary greatness. "Today, when I watch Steph play," Bird confessed, "I see someone who not only reached the standard that Reggie Miller established, but who created a completely new standard. He redefined what's possible to do on a basketball court." You can perceive that sometimes the most beautiful stories about overcoming are born not from easy encouragement, but from difficult challenges presented by people who believe in our potential more than we do ourselves. Bird had seen something in Curry that not even Curry himself knew existed. In 2024, with 4 NBA titles, 2 Finals MVPs, and a legacy that already placed him among the greatest of all time, Curry had finally silenced any questioning about his ability in decisive moments. More than that, he had completely redefined what it meant to be clutch in modern basketball. "If someone asked me today who is the best shooter in history," Bird said in a recent interview, "I would say Steph Curry without hesitation. And if they asked me who is more decisive in crucial moments, I would say the same thing." Bird's complete transformation of opinion about Curry represented more than a simple change of perspective. It represented the recognition that he had witnessed something rare in sports, the transformation of exceptional talent into a legend through systematic application of hard work and mental determination. "What Steph taught me," Bird reflected, "is that real greatness isn't just about natural talent. It's about how you respond when someone questions whether you really belong at the top. It's about using doubts as fuel to reach levels you didn't even know were possible." Naturally, this leads us to the deepest lesson of this entire story. Bird's words in 2015 weren't an attack on Steph Curry. They were a gift disguised as criticism. A gift that helped transform an already exceptional player into a force of nature that redefined an entire sport. Today, I look at Steph Curry and see exactly what I hope to see when I look at any great competitor," Bird concluded. "Someone who doesn't accept limitations, who transforms criticism into fuel, and who never stops looking for ways to prove he can be even better." Something that touches deeply is realizing that this story was never really about basketball. It was about how we respond to challenges, how we use others' doubts to discover internal reserves of greatness we didn't know we possessed, and how sometimes the most valuable lessons come from the most unexpected sources. Steph Curry had transformed 16 controversial words into a legendary career. Larry Bird had inadvertently become the mentor who helped create one of history's greatest players. And we all gained a lesson about how real greatness is forged, not in the absence of criticism, but in how we choose to respond to it.